The screaming started before I even got through the door. I had both hands full with grocery bags, my phone wedged between my shoulder and talking to my sister about nothing important. Then I heard it. Not regular arguing. Not even loud disagreement. This was raw. Animal. The kind of sound that makes your stomach drop before your brain catches up. I pushed through the unlocked door of my mother-in-law's house, Vivian, bags still cutting into my fingers. The hallway felt longer than usual. Each step brought me closer to a noise I didn't want to understand. My heart hammered against my ribs. When I reached the living room doorway, everything stopped making sense. Courtney, my husband's side chick, was on top of Vivian. Her teeth were sunk deep into the older woman's arm. Blood smeared across pale fabric. Skin broken. Real violence happening in front of me. Vivian thrashed and screamed. Cushions fell. A lamp crashed over. Courtney pulled back just long enough to scream one sentence that changed everything. You lied to me. The grocery bag slipped from my hands. Milk spilled across the hardwood floor in a white pool that nobody cared about anymore. Then I saw him. My husband Brandon stood frozen near the window, watching everything unfold like he'd been expecting this moment for months. I moved forward on instinct, but Brandon grabbed my wrist before I could reach them. His grip was tight, urgent, almost painful. Don't call the police, he said quietly. Please. Not are you okay? Not what happened. Just damage control. Just protection. Courtney staggered backward, hands shaking violently. She looked down at her own hands like they belonged to someone else. Vivian collapsed onto the sofa, clutching her bleeding arm, crying loud enough for neighbors 3 houses down to hear. I searched Brandon's face for shock, for confusion, for anything human. There was nothing. Only fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of consequences finally arriving. That's when Courtney pointed directly at Vivian with a trembling finger. I paid you, she screamed through tears. You said he was leaving her. You said Brandon was going to marry me. I paid you for a year. The room went silent. Even Vivian stopped crying. I felt the floor tilt beneath my feet. I turned slowly toward the older woman, waiting for denial. Waiting for outrage. Waiting for her to say this woman was lying. She didn't deny anything. Instead, she reached out gently and took Courtney's trembling hand in both of hers. That's when everything inside me broke. Vivian squeezed Courtney's hand with genuine tenderness. Her voice came out calm and certain, like she was stating an obvious fact everyone else had somehow missed. I love you, she said clearly. I want you to spend the rest of your life with my son. You're the one I chose. The words weren't emotional. They were confident. Final. Then she turned her head toward me. This marriage was never meant to last. The sentence landed heavy and absolute, like a door slamming shut behind me with no handle on my side. I was still standing there, still technically married, still breathing, somehow already replaced by a decision made without my knowledge or consent. I looked at Brandon, silently begging him to interrupt, to correct her, to pull me back into reality where I still mattered. He didn't move. Courtney laughed suddenly, sharp, hysterical. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked straight at me. You think he's leaving you, she said. Her voice wasn't cruel. It sounded like a warning. He's not. I didn't understand what she meant yet, but the way she said it made my blood run cold. The room felt wrong. Like everyone knew the ending except me. Like I was standing inside a decision that had already been made months ago. Courtney's laughter stopped as suddenly as it started. She turned back to Vivian, her voice cracking with desperation. Then why am I still paying? No one answered. Brandon's jaw tightened. Vivian looked away. The silence stretched until it started to hurt. That's when she explained everything. For over 14 months, she had been giving Vivian money. Regular transfers. Cash handed over during private meetings. Help for family emergencies. Support for legal fees. All under one promise. That my marriage was ending. That divorce was being handled quietly. That elders were involved. That lawyers needed retainers. That paperwork took time but was definitely being filed. I felt sick listening to it. My vision blurred at the edges. I asked the only question that mattered through numb lips. Where does Brandon stand in all this? Courtney turned to him slowly. Her eyes searched his face desperately. When were you leaving her? She asked. What's the actual date? Brandon opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, then started talking about complications, about timing, about how marriage wasn't simple. That was when her face changed. Not anger anymore. Horror. She realized there was no timeline, no plan, no real intention. And I understood something terrifying. My entire life had been used as collateral in a promise I never agreed to. Vivian finally spoke, defensive but completely unapologetic. She said she was securing the future. That marriages didn't end overnight. That these things required patience and strategy. Courtney began listing what she had paid for. Her voice shook but stayed clear. Lawyer consultations that never happened. Court filing fees that went nowhere. Family council meetings that were never scheduled. Emergency situations that didn't exist. Wedding savings for a ceremony that was never planned. I stood there completely numb as the truth settled into my bones like poison. This wasn't an affair. Not really. It was a financial scheme built entirely on the assumption that my life was temporary. That I was already gone. That my presence was just an administrative delay. Courtney wasn't trying to steal Brandon. She genuinely believed she was buying a future she had been promised by someone with authority. And Vivian had sold it to her confidently. Repeatedly. For over a year. I looked at Brandon again. He stared at the floor like it held answers. That silence told me everything I needed to know. He hadn't corrected the lie. He hadn't stopped it. He had benefited from it while pretending ignorance. Suddenly, the bite made complete sense. Not as violence. As collapse. The physical breaking point of a fantasy fed for too long by people who never intended to deliver. Courtney's voice dropped to something quiet and dangerous. She looked directly at Brandon and asked again, slower this time, enunciating every word. Just tell me when. Give me one date. No one spoke. The room held its breath. Brandon rubbed his face like this conversation exhausted him more than it exposed him. He said things like eventually and when things settle. He talked about pressure from family, about cultural complications, about how nothing in marriage was simple or quick. But he never gave a date, never gave a specific plan, never said the word divorce out loud. I watched understanding spread across her face in real time. Her confidence drained away completely, replaced by something hollow and broken. She realized there was no timeline because there was no real intention. Nothing Vivian promised had any actual power. Nothing she paid for had any influence over reality. She turned toward Vivian slowly, her movements mechanical. You knew, she whispered. You knew Brandon was never leaving her. Vivian shrugged like it didn't matter. Like the truth was irrelevant compared to intentions. I did what I could, she said simply. That was it. No apology. No shame. No acknowledgement of what had been stolen. I felt something cold and permanent settle in my chest. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't miscommunication. It was deliberate manipulation, and everyone in this room had known except the two women who mattered most. Courtney demanded her money back. Her voice cracked with desperation as she listed amounts and dates. She begged, not loudly, but with a kind of disbelief that made the air feel thick. Vivian listened with her head tilted, arms folded across her chest. When Courtney finally finished, the older woman laughed. Not nervously, not awkwardly. She laughed like someone who felt completely protected. You paid willingly, she said. I didn't force you. You made a choice. That laugh broke something fundamental. Courtney screamed and launched herself forward before anyone could react. I heard the sound before I saw it happen. Teeth against skin. A sharp, wet cry of pain. Blood appeared instantly around her mouth. Vivian shrieked, thrashing violently, knocking over everything within reach. Cushions flew. The coffee table tipped. Courtney pulled back suddenly, horrified by her own actions. Her hands shook uncontrollably as reality crashed down around all of us. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't rivalry over a man. It was humiliation made physical. The moment she understood she had funded a complete lie, that she had been used by both mother and son together, her body reacted before her mind could stop it. I stood frozen, heart racing, watching a fantasy collapse in the ugliest way possible. That bite wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the moment the truth finally drew blood. The sound of sirens drifted in faintly from somewhere down the street. Neighbors shouted through shed walls. Someone pounded on the front door. Brandon moved fast then. He grabbed my arm again, his voice frantic and low. Please, he whispered desperately. Don't call anyone. Don't tell them what happened. Vivian immediately insisted it was an accident. That Courtney had slipped. That everything was being exaggerated. That people were overreacting. Courtney sat on the floor now, rocking back and forth. She whispered the same sentence over and over like a broken recording. He's never leaving her. He was never leaving her. And somehow, all eyes turned to me, waiting. I realized then how deep this really went. They weren't asking me to tell the truth. They were asking me to protect them. To keep the secret contained. To make myself smaller so they could survive the exposure. No one asked how I felt. No one asked what this had done to me. No one cared about my shock or pain. I was simply expected to absorb it quietly, the way I always had before. That was the moment my real role became crystal clear. I wasn't family to these people. I was a shield. A cover. A convenient piece of legitimacy. As long as I stayed silent, they believed this could still be contained and managed. I nodded without agreeing. I said nothing without forgiving. And in that silence, I made a decision I didn't announce to anyone. I stopped reacting. I started watching. After the chaos finally settled, Vivian pulled me aside into the kitchen. Her arm was bandaged now. Her face had returned to its usual calm mask, like nothing unusual had happened. I chose her, she said quietly, looking me directly in the eyes. I just didn't succeed this time. Then she smiled. Thin. Confident. Almost pleased with herself. Enjoy your marriage while it lasts. The threat wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It sat heavy and cold in my chest long after she walked away. That night, I checked our joint bank account on my phone. Money was gone. Transferred without my knowledge or permission. Not a small amount. Enough to notice. Enough to hurt our savings significantly. Something finally clicked into place in my mind. This wasn't just emotional betrayal. This was strategic. Planned. Organized. The affair. The promises. The money transfers. The silence when I asked questions. All of it fit together perfectly like puzzle pieces I had refused to see before. I thought back to every single time Brandon said Vivian needed help. Every time he dismissed my questions about where money was going. Every time I was told not to worry about family matters. I had been trusting people who were actively planning around me. Who saw me as temporary. Who were already building a future that didn't include me. I didn't confront him that night. I didn't cry or scream. I lay awake listening to his breathing, realizing the marriage I thought I was protecting had already been sold off in pieces. The messages started after midnight. Long, rambling texts. Voice notes where she cried and cried some more. Courtney told me everything she'd held back before. How Vivian had promised authority as a mother. How she said marriages end when mothers decide. How she was told repeatedly that I was almost gone. Just a matter of paperwork. I believed her, she kept saying. I actually believed her. I listened without interrupting. Without defending myself. Without offering comfort or sympathy. Not because I didn't feel anything. But because something fundamental inside me had shifted. I wasn't angry at her anymore. The rage had drained away completely. She wasn't the villain I had imagined. She was reckless. Yes. Unstable. Dangerous in her desperation. But she was also another victim who had believed the wrong people. What frightened me most wasn't her bite or her screaming. It was the calm manipulation that had come before it all. The calculated promises. The systematic collection of money. The confidence in lies that had no foundation. I replayed her messages multiple times that night, catching details I had missed initially. Dates that matched financial records. Amounts that corresponded to our missing savings. Promises that lined up with Brandon's absences. That was the night I stopped responding emotionally to anything. I didn't block her. I didn't argue back. Instead, I started methodically saving everything she sent. Screenshots. Voice notes. Timelines written out in detail. Because for the first time, I understood that truth wasn't going to announce itself loudly enough. It was going to have to be proven carefully. The next few days, I moved through my life quietly. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I didn't confront Brandon or Vivian. I simply watched. I listened. I documented. I started with our bank statements, scrolling back month by month, line by line. At first, everything looked ordinary. Transfers marked as family help, notes that said emergency or medical, small withdrawals that only added up if you actually paid attention. Then patterns began emerging clearly. The same dates repeating. The same amounts transferred. Always after phone calls to Vivian. Always explained as temporary. I checked accounts connected to Brandon's small business. Then our savings. Then anything with his name attached to it. That's when I saw it. Some of the money Courtney had given Vivian hadn't stayed with her. It had moved. Slowly. Carefully. Through multiple accounts connected to Brandon's business. Not directly. Never obviously. Just enough distance to deny clear intent. My hands physically shook as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't generosity gone wrong. This wasn't confusion. It was money laundering disguised as family help. It was systematic fraud using trust and relationship as cover. The affair wasn't messy at all. It was organized. Planned. Profitable. I sat there staring at numbers on my phone screen, feeling something completely unexpected replace all my anger and hurt. Clarity. Pure, cold clarity. They hadn't underestimated my love for Brandon. They had underestimated my attention to detail, my ability to see patterns, my willingness to actually look, and that mistake was going to cost them absolutely everything. I didn't confront Brandon immediately. I waited until I had every piece lined up perfectly, until my voice could stay completely steady. When I finally showed him the printed statements, he didn't panic or deny. He sighed. Like I was being difficult. Like I was making a problem out of nothing. I never actually planned to leave you, he said. Like that sentence should comfort me somehow. I waited silently. I had learned that silence makes people fill empty space with truth. Then he added, almost casually, shrugging slightly, but I didn't stop it either. That single sentence landed harder than any confession possibly could have. He didn't frame what happened as betrayal. He framed it as inevitability. Like this was something that happened around him, not something he actively allowed and benefited from. I asked him directly why he let it continue for over a year. He said Vivian was persistent and difficult to refuse. He said Courtney had been useful during a difficult time. He said things got out of hand faster than he expected. Useful. That specific word echoed in my head long after our conversation ended. I realized then with absolute certainty that I wasn't married to a man who made mistakes. I was married to someone who carefully calculated risk and called it circumstance when caught. He hadn't lied outright to anyone. He had simply let lies grow wherever they benefited him most. That half-truth was infinitely worse than direct denial would have been, because it told me exactly who he really was underneath everything. After that conversation, something fundamental settled into place inside me. A truth I hadn't wanted to face finally made complete sense. I wasn't the obstacle in this situation. I was the anchor. I was the legitimate wife. The legal stability. The proof that everything was normal, while lies happened constantly behind my back. My presence in Brandon's life made the fantasy believable to everyone else. As long as I stayed married and quiet and trusting, Courtney kept believing she was close to winning. Kept paying money. Kept waiting patiently. Brandon genuinely needed me exactly where I was. Married to him. Unaware of details. Trusting his explanations. That realization was deeply painful, but it was also incredibly clarifying. I stopped asking myself what I had done wrong. I stopped wondering why I wasn't good enough. None of this had ever been about inadequacy. It was entirely about utility. About usefulness. About convenience. Once I fully understood that, my emotions changed completely. The fear softened and disappeared. The confusion evaporated. In its place came something much calmer and more dangerous. Detachment. I began moving differently through my life. I stopped explaining my feelings. I stopped defending my reactions. I stopped reacting at all to small provocations. People consistently underestimate silence when it comes from someone who has finally understood the real game being played around them. I wasn't freezing in fear anymore. I was choosing my next moves carefully. And for the first time since this entire situation started, I felt something close to real control returning. Not power over them. Power over myself. Vivian called a family meeting under the excuse of clearing the air. It was obviously staged to regain control. I could tell by how confident and formal she sounded on the phone. When we gathered at her house, she spoke first. She described Courtney as dangerously unstable, overly emotional, prone to violence. She carefully positioned herself as the wounded mother caught innocently in the middle of chaos she hadn't created. I let her talk without interruption. Every sentence she spoke revealed more than she realized. She talked about expectations she'd had, about investments in the family's future, about how patience would eventually be rewarded for everyone involved. When someone finally asked why Courtney genuinely believed marriage was guaranteed, Vivian hesitated for just a fraction too long. Then she said carefully, "I told her I would do what I could to help." That tiny pause changed the entire energy in the room. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't make accusations. I simply asked one very clear question. What exactly did you take money for? Her answer wasn't denial or confusion. It was justification. She said she had expected repayment would come through marriage eventually, through loyalty demonstrated over time, through final outcomes that benefited everyone. That was the precise moment when people around the room began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Because good intentions become completely irrelevant when specific outcomes are repeatedly promised in exchange for money. And everyone present finally understood something they'd been avoiding. This wasn't miscommunication or confusion. It was a transaction that had failed to deliver. Courtney arrived late to the meeting. Her eyes were swollen and red. Her posture was rigid with tension. She didn't sit down when she entered. She stood directly in front of Vivian and asked one simple question. Did you ever actually have the power to end her marriage? The entire room went completely silent. Vivian looked at Brandon first, then back at Courtney. And finally, after a very long pause, she said the truth she had successfully avoided for over 14 months. No, she admitted quietly. I hoped I could influence the situation. That single word collapsed everything instantly. Hope wasn't a plan. It wasn't authority. It wasn't a promise worth thousands of dollars in payments. Courtney laughed softly. The sound was completely empty and broken. She nodded slowly like something had finally clicked into place after a very long time. So you sold me something you never actually owned, she said clearly. Vivian didn't respond. She didn't need to. The damage was completely done. I watched Courtney's anger drain away entirely, replaced by deep grief and total humiliation. She hadn't lost a man in this situation. She had lost a future she genuinely believed was guaranteed. A life she had paid for in advance. In that exact moment, I felt absolutely no triumph. Only clarity about what had really happened here. The lie simply couldn't survive direct daylight. And the people who had built it so carefully no longer had anywhere safe to hide from truth. After the admission, the energy in the room shifted completely. Courtney no longer looked at me with anger or resentment. She barely looked at me at all anymore. Her entire focus locked onto Vivian with an intensity that made everyone uncomfortable. You told me mothers decide everything, she said clearly. You told me you had traditional authority in this family. Vivian straightened her back defensively, pride flaring despite everything. I did what any mother would do, she snapped back. I wanted the best woman for my son. That's my right. For him, Courtney repeated slowly. Not for me. You used me. Brandon tried stepping in then, attempting to calm them both down, but his voice carried absolutely no weight anymore. Neither woman even acknowledged he'd spoken. They turned on each other with words that had clearly been waiting months to finally surface. Accusations spilled out rapidly. Promises were repeated aloud for the first time in front of witnesses. I sat quietly in my chair, watching carefully as alliances collapsed in real time. For the first time since this began, I wasn't positioned as the enemy. I wasn't the obstacle standing between them and happiness. I was completely irrelevant to their fight now. And surprisingly, that hurt much less than I expected it to. Because my relevance to them had been my trap all along. As they argued loudly, I felt myself stepping back emotionally. Like someone finally leaving a burning building after realizing it had never been safe. The truth didn't need me anymore to survive. It had its own momentum now. When the shouting finally burned itself out completely, I spoke for the first time. My voice surprised even me. It was calm. Even. Completely steady despite everything. I don't need any more explanations, I said clearly. I brought actual facts instead. I placed documents on the table one at a time. bank statements, transfer records, screenshots of messages between them, voice notes queued and ready to play. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't make accusations or speak emotionally. I simply connected dots that were already there. Dates matched perfectly. Amounts repeated consistently. Promises lined up exactly with payments received. The room grew quieter with every single page I laid down. Vivian tried interrupting twice, but I kept going without acknowledgement. I wasn't interested in debating anymore. I was documenting. This wasn't about who felt more hurt. It wasn't about who had better intentions. It was purely about what could be proven with evidence. When I finally finished, no one spoke for a very long time. Even Brandon stared at the papers spread across the table like they had personally betrayed him somehow. That heavy silence felt more powerful than any amount of shouting. Because silence in response to evidence means there's absolutely nothing left to deny. I realized then that crying would have been easier for them to dismiss entirely. Anger would have been easier to twist into something else. But facts don't bend for anyone's comfort. I gathered my papers calmly and carefully, exactly the way someone does when they already know the outcome. And for the first time since this began, I knew with certainty that I didn't need to convince anyone of anything. The truth had already done that work completely for me. That night, Brandon finally begged. Not in front of anyone else. Not dramatically. Quietly, in our bedroom, where lies had always felt safest for him. "Please don't destroy everything we built," he said. I waited patiently for him to say he was sorry. He never did. Instead, he talked only about consequences, about reputation in the community, about how this situation would look to others. He said the affair had never been serious emotionally. He used that word useful again, which made my stomach physically tighten. Useful to whom? Exactly? I wanted to ask but didn't. To him, obviously. To his comfort. To his options. He told me he loved me. He said we could definitely fix things if I just tried. He said I was overreacting to something that was basically handled now. Handled. As if this was a plumbing problem. As if trust was a faucet you could simply tighten. I looked at him carefully and realized something important. He wasn't actually afraid of losing me. He was afraid of losing control over the situation. That distinction mattered enormously. I told him very calmly that I wasn't interested in protecting anyone anymore. That my silence had been my biggest mistake in all of this. For the first time in our entire marriage, he didn't argue back or try to convince me otherwise. He just watched me like he was finally seeing a version of me he couldn't manage or manipulate. And that reality frightened him far more than my anger ever could have. That night, I slept without touching him. Not out of spite or punishment. Out of clarity that had finally arrived. Courtney called me the next morning. Her voice sounded completely hollow and exhausted. She asked directly if I thought she could legally get her money back. Not emotionally. Not morally. Legally. It was the first time she had spoken to me without any anger or entitlement in her tone. She explained that Vivian had stopped answering her calls completely. That the woman who once promised her an entire future now claimed illness and memory problems. Victimhood had arrived right on schedule. I told her the honest truth without sugarcoating anything. I said she had voluntarily paid for promises that were never legally enforceable. That hope and intention aren't binding contracts. She went quiet for a very long moment. "I completely ruined my life," she said finally. I didn't correct her. I didn't comfort her. I didn't judge her either. This wasn't my lesson to teach. This wasn't my responsibility to fix. What struck me most was how quickly everything changed once money stopped flowing. Love vanished immediately. Loyalty evaporated overnight. The warmth Vivian had shown had disappeared completely. Courtney wasn't chosen anymore. She was inconvenient. Problematic. Best forgotten. And for the first time, she was understanding what it actually meant to be disposable in a system built entirely on manipulation. I ended the call feeling absolutely no satisfaction. Only a deepening resolve. Because watching another woman learn this truth too late didn't heal anything inside me. But leaving before it happened to me definitely would. I stopped protecting any of them after that conversation. Quietly. Deliberately. Without announcing my intentions to anyone. I separated our finances completely. I gathered important documents. I changed all my passwords. I stopped sharing plans or schedules. I didn't confront Vivian again. I didn't argue with Brandon about what had happened. I didn't try explaining myself to anyone who had already decided who I was to them. I focused entirely on logistics, on stability, on making absolutely certain I would be safe when this finally ended. There was no dramatic moment, no shouting match, no final argument that changed everything. Just quiet, careful preparation. That calm terrified Brandon more than rage ever could have. He kept asking what I was thinking, what I was planning. I told him the complete truth every time. I'm thinking about myself. For years, I had been taught that choosing myself was fundamentally selfish, that endurance equaled loyalty, that silence proved strength. I understood now how dangerously wrong that thinking was. Real strength isn't staying where you're being actively used. Real strength is leaving before the damage becomes completely irreversible. When I finally told him directly that I was done with this marriage, he looked genuinely stunned. Like he had simply assumed I would always be there to absorb the fallout of his choices. That assumption was his final mistake. And this time, I didn't bother correcting it. I walked away and let reality teach him what I no longer would. Once my silence finally broke, it broke everywhere at once. Family members who had treated me like an inconvenience suddenly wanted detailed explanations. Messages arrived in cautious waves. I didn't rush to answer any of them. I waited until I could speak without any emotion clouding my words. When I finally shared what had actually happened, I didn't dramatize anything. I shared records, timelines, voice notes, pure facts. I let people hear promises repeated in the exact same confident tone Vivian had used on me for years. The shift in perception was immediate and total. People who had defended her for months grew suddenly quiet. Those who had warned me years earlier finally spoke up. Apologies arrived slowly and awkwardly, like people weren't sure they were still welcome. I accepted none of them personally. This wasn't about forgiveness or reconciliation. It was purely about clarity. What surprised me most wasn't how quickly the narrative flipped completely. It was how fragile that narrative had always been. One truth, placed carefully in the right context, dismantled months of gossip and manipulation instantly. Vivian didn't reach out to me at all. Brandon stopped trying to explain things away. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful exactly, but it was honest for the first time. For the first time in years, no one was actively rewriting the story around me anymore. They had nothing left to protect. And I finally understood that truth doesn't need to be loud to be completely devastating. It just needs to be undeniable. Brandon accused me of revenge when he finally realized I wouldn't back down from ending this. He said I was destroying the family intentionally, that I was enjoying this situation too much. I didn't argue with him. I didn't try correcting his perception. I told him very calmly, this isn't revenge. It's accountability. That single word made him angrier than any insult possibly could have. Accountability meant he couldn't talk his way out anymore. He couldn't blame emotion or misunderstanding. He had to face actual outcomes of choices he made deliberately. Courtney blocked him everywhere around this same time. Calls went unanswered. Messages stayed unread. For the first time in years, he stood without women cushioning every decision. I watched him spiral from a safe distance. Not with satisfaction. With detachment. He wasn't losing love in this situation. He was losing control. And control had always been his real currency in relationships. He tried to bargain with me. Made promises. Expressed regret. Used nostalgia. I didn't engage at all. Those manipulation tools only work when someone is still invested in the illusion. I wasn't anymore. Letting go didn't feel dramatic like I'd imagined. It felt surprisingly quiet. Like closing a door you didn't realize had been standing open for years, letting in cold air. And once it finally shut completely, the noise from the other side stopped mattering at all. That was the exact moment Brandon realized I was actually gone for good. Not physically yet, but emotionally. And that's what actually mattered. Courtney left town without any announcement. No goodbyes. No explanations to anyone. One day she was still calling occasionally, still hoping desperately for some kind of restitution. The next day, her number was disconnected completely. I heard through other people that she had moved back home with her family, that she was trying to rebuild something from whatever remained of her life. I didn't reach out to her. I didn't send messages of support or understanding. Her story wasn't mine to resolve or fix. What stayed with me was how quickly she had gone from chosen to disposable once money stopped flowing. Love vanished immediately. Loyalty evaporated overnight. The warmth Vivian had shown had turned to complete silence. It confirmed everything I had already learned. This was never about wives versus side chicks. It wasn't about who was better or more deserving. It was purely about usefulness to them. Once that ended, so did their interest. Vivian retreated into illness and self-pity. She stopped speaking to people who asked difficult questions. She stopped pretending to care about reconciliation. Brandon tried one final time to get me to intervene. To smooth things over. To fix what he'd broken. I refused completely. I wasn't interested in rescuing anyone anymore from consequences they'd earned. Watching all of them lose the structure that supported their behavior felt less like victory and more like closure. The truth had done its job thoroughly, and I was finally free to leave without dragging anyone else's secrets behind me anymore. I filed for divorce quietly. No dramatic announcements. No warnings. Just paperwork, signatures, and a steady resolve that surprised even me. When Brandon realized it was genuinely real, truly happening, he panicked visibly. He asked what he could possibly do to stop it. He asked if we could just reset everything. I told him no. Not because I was angry anymore, but because I was completely done negotiating my worth. For years, I had been told patience was virtue and endurance equaled love. I finally understood that both concepts had been used specifically to keep me compliant. This ending wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about preservation. About survival. I needed my actual life back. As the divorce process moved forward steadily, I felt lighter. Not relieved exactly. Unburdened. Like someone who finally set down a weight they didn't realize they'd been carrying for years. There were still moments of sadness. Grief doesn't disappear just because clarity arrives. But even that grief felt honest now. Brandon lost control of the narrative completely. That frightened him more than losing me ever did. I didn't correct his assumptions or explain anything further. I didn't need him to understand anymore. Understanding had never protected me before from any of this. Choosing myself finally did. And for the first time in my entire adult life, that choice felt permanent. This ending wasn't about revenge or proving anything to anyone. It was purely about survival. People ask me now how I feel about everything that happened. They want anger, vindication, some kind of dramatic satisfaction. The truth is simpler than that. Courtney bit Vivian because she learned the truth too late. She realized she had funded a future that was never real, promised by people who had no intention of ever delivering it. Her body reacted before her pride could catch up. I walked away because I learned the truth in time. That difference changed absolutely everything. The most dangerous people aren't the ones who explode violently when betrayed. They're the ones who smile calmly, make promises they don't own, and let others pay for fantasies while staying clean themselves. I don't hate any of them now. Hatred would mean they still mattered enough to occupy my thoughts. What I feel is distance. Distance from manipulation. Distance from silence. Distance from being useful instead of valued. My life is quieter now. Smaller in some ways. Stronger in others. I trust myself more than I ever did before. And if there's one thing I know for absolute certain, it's this. Lies can survive emotion. They can survive hope. They can even survive love for a while. But they cannot survive truth spoken clearly and calmly. That truth didn't need my rage to work. It only needed my courage to walk away. Courtney bit her because she learned the truth too late. I walked away because I learned it in time.